Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Dr. Abbie Maroño, who is a behavioral scientist as well as a nonverbal communication expert. Abbie, it's so good to see you. You and I normally speak about CEOs. We're talking about the GOP debate. Let me just start with the question, is it as easy to judge that group on stage? Because I would assume most of them have had a lot of training in what you and I are talking about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because when we're looking at nonverbals, it's much easier to detect discomfort than it is comfort, because discomfort is the absence of comfort. And politicians, they have a lot of training. And it's very, very clear, so they're very much in control. And you could see that last night, because in a situation like that, you would expect to see things like lots of self-touch displays. When we're nervous, we touch the face a lot, particularly the lips, and we kind of hold our hands together a lot. You didn't see that at all once. And that's a really, really unconscious, natural display. So if you're in a situation like an interview and I say, don't touch your face, don't put your hands together, it's actually really difficult to do unless you've had a lot of training. And I think just that alone really exemplifies that they've had a lot of coaching.
That said, what stood out to you in terms of who was most effective and perhaps who could use a little more training?
So what's interesting, I love to assess the nonverbals before they think anything has started. So they really think that it begins when they're introduced, but it begins the second they're on stage. So when the national anthem was being sung, you could see their nonverbals, you could see them getting ready. And there were some really interesting behaviors going on there. So we saw Governor Hutchinson kind of stepping backwards and forwards a little bit. So you could see him kind of pacing, and that's a discomfort display. And you could see the same with Senator Scott. But what really stood out, you saw Governor Burgum kick his leg back. He kicked his leg back almost to stretch it. Now, our legs are really strong indicators of our emotions because they're tied to the flight response. You know, if you want to get out of a situation, the first thing you need to mobilize is your legs. So they're really strong indicators. So his legs were saying, I want to be out of here. So you could see the nerves straight away. And then we see the camera move and, you know, everybody does the wave. What stood out was one individual did not wave. He stood out, and that was Senator Scott. You could see that there was a lot of nerves there. So straight away that stood out to me. And that carried on. You could hear a very shaky voice. And we've spoken about this before. You know, when we're nervous, adrenaline is released in the body, and it causes our muscles to tense, and it causes this tenseness in the vocal cords, so they can't vibrate freely. So the voice becomes shaky, and it's hard to control. And you could hear that when he started speaking. But despite that, he still had a lot of power in his voice when he was speaking. You know, he used great intonation, you know, food up 20%, pause. Gas up 20%, pause. Even though he was nervous. But he did show gestures that showed nervousness. So he did kind of like a half point where he went to give an extended gesture and kind of pulled it back. And you could see him become more comfortable as it went on. So the initial start, I would say, he was the most uncomfortable. He showed the most discomfort there.
It makes sense to some extent because we're talking about three of the candidates who are, you know, ranked lower in the polls thus far. So I would think it's nerve-wracking to be in that setting. One person I'm really curious about is the one woman up there, you know, former governor, former ambassador as well, Nikki Haley. How do you think she did? Because I'm curious too if what effective communication in a woman is different than in a man in terms of how we perceive it.
So I think she did a really good job at controlling her nerves. You could see the nerves in her mouth. There was a lot of tension here in the sides of her mouth. They were very, very tight, particularly at the beginning, but she maintained really good control. Her voice rarely faltered the whole way through. And she's a very good comparison between her and Ramaswamy, because she didn't show big gestures. Her gestures were very controlled, but she was very comfortable in her space. She didn't keep her limbs too close to her body. She used a lot of gestures, and they were very consistent with what she was saying as well. They complemented her verbals very nicely. And she seemed very natural. And that was a kind of like a quiet confidence. Whereas with Ramaswamy, you see this big, bold confidence. You know, he was having fun on stage. He was very comfortable. But he slipped almost into dominance, where you're very big. And at one point, he was so wide that the camera had to switch to a wide lens. And he was reaching over, almost touching Haley. Now, she didn't falter then as well. She didn't pull herself back. She stayed very calm, very collected in her space. And I think her confidence felt more natural, because it didn't feel almost theatrical. She was just very comfortable moving around in her own space almost. When I teach confidence, I say, imagine you're moving through water. Imagine you're being very smooth. And that's how her gestures felt to me. And what else stood out about her behavior, which was really nice, was she did really good, you know, head nods along with what she was saying. She did a lot of head tilts as well, particularly when she was talking about issues she felt strongly on. And we love a head tilt.
Do we? Why do we love a head tilt? Why do we love a head tilt?
It's a
she
sign
says,
of
tilting her head.
So when we expose a part of our neck, it shows that we're vulnerable. So if we go back in our evolutionary history, you know, there is a threat. Neck is a very vulnerable part. So if we show our neck, we're showing that we're vulnerable. Now we look at the research and we can see that even, you know, young children and infants, they're really drawn to this head tilt. We like to look at it, and it makes us feel comfortable. She did a really good job at doing that when she was talking about points that she was obviously very passionate about.
Now, Vivek Ramaswamy, you mentioned, obviously he was coming on to make an impression, partly because he also is somebody who one could argue is an underdog. I suppose you could say everybody on that stage could qualify, but if you were counseling him, was that an effective nonverbal strategy for what he wanted to achieve?
I think he definitely made a lasting impression. And you can see it was working for him. He was very bold and very, very much in control. And he had a great big smile. And you could see and hear the audience really thriving from that. He did lose it a little bit as the time went on. He had a bit of a clash with Haley, and that smile turned into a grimace. You could see that he was very angry, and I think that was just before he'd reached into her space. Now, this is where I really want to exemplify the difference between confidence and dominance again. Confidence is about being comfortable in your space. Dominance is about dominating the space. I'm comfortable in my space, but I'm also comfortable in your space. Your space belongs to me. It's a power display. And he was doing that. By reaching into her space, he was really showing, I have the power here. He was really trying to dominate that. He did a really good job as well of keeping his chin up the whole time. Kept his chin up. He kept very poised. If I was coaching him, I think I would have said just tone it down a little bit. Because this theatrical performance, although it does leave an impression, it can appear less authentic. Not necessarily that he was faking all of it. I think he was very comfortable on stage. That was very clear. But it can appear less authentic than if you just make it a little bit more subtle.
Christie, when you talk about the crowd's energy, he was somebody who generated some audible boos right from the start. I don't know if you could feel that in his manner, or, you know, what impression did he leave you with?
So he was confident, but he was a calm confident. He was tall and not slouched, but he wasn't poised like DeSantis. And I think, you know, DeSantis has a military background. That is very clear. He's very poised, but he still showed confidence. He had a very strong and powerful use of intonation. Make a point, pause, point, pause. You did cling to what he was saying, And he did show a lot of emotional expressivity. Now, when he said, "I'm surprised," he showed surprised. When he was saying that he was empathetic, he showed it. But I think he did get a lot of boos when the Trump name was mentioned, because he stood out. So when Trump's name was mentioned, first we see Ramaswamy's hand go right up. And then we see almost a social proof situation going on, where we see a hand looking around, we see another hand, and everybody's like, "Oh, is everybody putting
who wants to be on the record on this one?" Right.
Yeah, but with Christie, it was different. And I think this is where he got a bit of a look from the audience and some boos. He put his hand up and down and up, and then kind of wagged his finger a little bit. And here you see his behavior really falter. Because for the first time in any of the candidates, we see a repetitive display. So he had his pen and he started repeatedly clicking it. This is a nervous display. He was really uncomfortable. And then he put it back in his pocket, and then he pulled it out again. And this repetitive display, another repetitive display, is really showing that discomfort. And after he finished speaking, he got a lot of boos. He didn't stand tall with his chin up like Ramaswamy did when he was getting booed. After he made his point, he put his head down and he kind of stepped away slightly. And again, for the first time, he made himself very small. And this open versus closed, make myself big versus small, is really, really telling. When we're comfortable and confident, we feel fine to take up space. I'm comfortable in the space around me. I don't need to make myself disappear. When we're nervous and anxious, we want to disappear. We make ourselves small. And he started to do that around that point.
I want to ask about Mike Pence. I know we're working our way toward Ron DeSantis. There was a lot of exchanges between Mike Pence and various others on stage. Give me first your assessment of how he did.
He was showing a lot of dominance. I think he was very much in control. He did show some nervousness in the mouth, but that is to be expected because it is a nervous situation and you care. He showed a lot of open palm gestures. Now, he made them very powerful because with his hands, they weren't together like this. His fingers were spread. This is more powerful. He meant what he was saying. And his gestures were really interesting because at one point, when he was making a point, he used his hands like that. He was bringing up the point and the audience followed along. He was commanding the audience almost like an orchestra at one point. And I thought that was really powerful. And you could see he was really asserting dominance. Unlike Haley, his gestures weren't smooth. They were bold. They were sharp. They were intentional.
Let me ask, because with Ramaswamy, you said dominance had sort of a negative connotation. When you're using it in the context of Pence, I'm hearing it as a positive connotation. I mean, so give me a sense as to what the difference is.
It can have both. So it can make you appear more powerful because you command the room. But the problem with dominance is it's not necessarily associated with trustworthiness, whereas confidence is. We see confident people and we associate that with trustworthiness. This has been shown time and time again in the literature. But dominance can be almost threatening. And that's the problem with it. And that's the thing. He interrupted quite a lot. He asserted his power. Now, it makes him appear powerful, absolutely. But does it make him appear trustworthy? Not really. And that's really the problem with it. You know, he even at one point interrupted the hosts. They were mid-speech, and he stopped them and carried on his speech. And at the end, when they gave their final statement, he did one final assertion of dominance. They had 30 seconds. He started with a joke, almost as if, I don't really care about the 30 seconds. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to tell a joke. This is my time. And then when the buzzer was going, he showed disgust almost. You could see his nose crinkle. And then he carried on speaking. It was like, this isn't going to stop me speaking.
It's almost like, I'm not going to say they've learned from the master, but certainly when we look at the last time around and Donald Trump and some of his body language on stage, I'm not sure if you saw the Tucker Carlson interview, but there must, in some ways, Donald Trump seems to have broken some of the rules of nonverbal communication, but successfully so. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
in a debate format?
Yeah, he's definitely non-verbally captivating. You don't always know what he's going to do, and we like that. We like novelty. It's interesting to look at. You know, if I'm stood here or sat here speaking to you, and I show you no behaviors, I show you no change in intonation, I show you nothing but monotone and inexpressivity, it's going to be really boring. He certainly does not do that. He is very expressive. It's exciting to watch the nonverbals. And I think Swami was almost aiming towards that. There were some gestures that you see Trump do. He does a lot of very, specific hand gestures. And you see that with Ramaswamy. So they can see that it is captivating, that it's working. So they do adopt that. And we know we learn from previous debates, and then we make that part of our behavior repertoire. And you can certainly see that with this year's candidates.
Let me ask about Ron DeSantis, and this basically the assessment that I, from various pundits was underwhelming, but there was a rational reason perhaps why he didn't want to make a big splash. I mean, what did you see in his body language in terms of his comfort level and how he was communicating his points?
That's really interesting, because with him, you can tell he has a military background. He is so poised, and he doesn't give much away, expressively with his face, nor his body. And some people can think that's a really good thing, because you think, well, no one can know exactly what I'm thinking, so I have the upper hand. The problem with that is it comes back to trustworthiness again. One of the things we judge trustworthiness on very strongly is emotional expressivity. We really want to see this. We particularly want to see positive countenance. He doesn't give that away, and it can lower that sense of trustworthiness. And I think he tried, because he did try and give a smile, but it was very tense. He had a shaky lip. It went up and down a little bit, and it increased the perception that he was uncomfortable. Now, I think he came to make a point. He was obviously very passionate. When he was speaking, you could see the passion in what he was saying. He meant what he said. And when he was asked certain questions, you could see again the discomfort here in his nose. So he really meant what he was saying. He had a lot of passion for the issues. He cared about the issue, but he was just too collected. I think he was too focused on not giving anything away, that he limited his ability to appear friendly, to appear likable. We really want to see them and make a judgment about their personalities. We want to see their personalities coming through, because it's not just the policies we buy into, it's the person. We want to see, what do you want to give me? Are you someone that I want to follow? Are you a leader that I trust, that I like, that I feel safe with? And when you give nothing away, it's really hard to make that judgment. And I think that was where this real issue with him came from. And at the end, he did give a smile, but it still didn't feel quite natural. It didn't feel quite comfortable.
So overall, in terms of your assessment, just the experience, and again, I know the moderators are part of the show. Anything else that's on your radar that you would be watching for the next debate, perhaps?
I think it's very difficult with politicians, because all the normal signs for discomfort and distress that you look for, they're very well trained not to show those things, but they do slip out. And things that are hard to control, like the voice, it's very difficult to control that shaky voice, because it's due to the adrenaline. You can say, stop shaking, stop shaking, stop shaking. But if your vocal cords are tense, you can't make them stop shaking. And then things like blushing and sweating, like if you see a bead of sweat here, even if it's very well controlled, those things are because of biological responses with a nervous system that is really in overdrive. Those things are very difficult to control. So those things I always look for first, which is why I focus so much on the voice. But other than that, I think it's just those small behaviors. Like Haley, she did a really good job at being in control, but her hands gave it away. Because when she was pointing these 3 fingers, she had them gripped. This is very, very minor, but you could see they were gripped, and you could see they were. And when we put a lot of pressure, we're under more stress. So this was her way of calming herself. She probably did it completely unconsciously. But this tiny behavior gave her away when everything else said, I am calm, I am comfortable. So I try and look for those little behaviors that show increased pressure, increased tension. Are they stepping away from a point after they make their point? Because they kind of want to distance themselves from that.
Interesting stuff. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Dr. Abbie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.